Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. In the region and across the world, what are the repercussions of Hamas's attack and Israel's war on Gaza? Let's get to the bottom line. Well, if anybody thought that the Palestinian-Israeli issue could be contained or kept quiet forever, the events of the past few weeks have shattered that notion. After the Hamas attack of October 7th that killed more than 1,000 Israelis, mostly civilians, Israel launched a massive bombing campaign across the Gaza Strip, killing thousands of Palestinian civilians, mostly women and children, and displaced half the population. Israel has also cut off food, water, and electricity. And U.S. President Joe Biden spent 7 hours in Israel expressing his support, but also asking Israelis not to be blinded by rage. When he got back to Washington, he made his case to the American people for billions of dollars in new spending on Israel, bundled with Ukraine aid. So what's next for the people in the Middle East? And despite its overwhelming military power, how much leverage does the United States actually have? Today, we're talking with Daniel Levy, who was a longtime negotiator and advisor for the Israeli government during the Oslo peace talks, and he's now president of the U.S. Middle East Project. Daniel, thanks so much for joining us. Let me ask you, how should Israel respond in a way that you think would be fair and just?
I'm afraid I can't do justice to that question without acknowledging that we should never have been in this place. We should never have been in a situation where the constant warnings that you cannot leave the Palestinian situation to fester. You cannot have Palestinians who day after day, week after week, year after year, decade after decade, do not have their basic rights, live in a regime in which their freedoms are denied, they're permanently dispossessed. That there's a good reason that the Palestinian human rights groups, the Israeli human rights groups, and then Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch made a designation that the crime of apartheid was being committed by Israel against the Palestinians. Now, none of that justifies what happened. But those of us who were pleading with American administrations, with others, to get to the root causes, how can you have Gaza be besieged? Of course, now the nature of the blockade is even more horrendous. But for 16, 17 years, Gaza has been under this permanent system of an envelope of control by Israel, where Israel measured exactly what could go in and go out. There was a freedom of information request on the Israeli side, which revealed that the Israeli policy was to keep Gaza just above starvation level. Now, that is going to blow up. It's blown up now. And the question is, do we still stay stuck in a place where Israel believes that only a military response, that only by bludgeoning the Palestinian people into submission, will they what? Will they accept more occupation? Or are we going to deal with politics? Now, I know that politics can't be the only conversation. And Israel is justified. It owes its own people their security. I think it's gone about it in the most unserious way. Israel knows, because there have been ongoing interactions between Israel and Hamas, mostly via third parties. Many in the Israeli security establishment said constantly, we need a political horizon. We could bring Hamas into that. We could offer an alternative to Hamas, which is kind of classic counterinsurgency. You try and pull the population away. But you can't just say, OK, we've created a military modus vivendi, and now we stop. We keep the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank weak. We keep Hamas just at this level. So there needs to be a political concept to go with whatever military concept there is. Either that involves saying Hamas will have to be part of this. That's clearly not where the narrative is now, because Hamas is being called the new Nazis, worse than ISIS, and we can come back to that. Or there has to be a different political concept.
You and I have been talking about Israel-Palestine for decades, and this largely got shoved under the rug. As the Abraham Accords were coming along, people began ignoring it, and it exploded. And I'm just interested in what, from an underground tectonic perspective, do you think is realistic in the future of getting rid of this pressure and resolving this in any credible way?
You have to understand a few things. First of all, there was an attempt in Oslo, imperfect, wasn't going to deliver total justice. It came at a particular moment where on the Palestinian side, there had been a support for actually a deal that many Palestinians would consider isn't a great deal, just 22% of historic Palestine as a potential future state, without addressing the refugee displacement. But the PLO had come on board with that position, had established relations with America in the late 80s. 30 years ago in 93, that gets put into the Oslo framework. Israel had gone through the first intifada, a largely unarmed civil uprising that extracted costs from Israel. International dynamics were shifting. And Israel thought, maybe we actually have to do something about this Palestinian question. We can't let it fester. This is over 30 years ago. We're in a unipolar American moment after the Cold War. And the basic deal is a Palestinian party committed to negotiations, committed to a peaceful resistance of this question. And America's role was to guarantee that this got delivered on. And given the power asymmetry, occupying state, occupied people, the primary American role was to make sure Israel would actually walk back the occupation and allow for there to be a Palestinian state. Now, that didn't happen. And we've gone through various iterations of how does one manage the outcome of America not playing the role designated for it in that equation. And we got more and more into fantastical thinking that if you just addressed economic peace, which also never succeeded, by the way, but this was the American playbook for many, many years. If you built relations between Israel and its neighbors with whom it is not at war, this was the Trumpian approach, then you could leap over the Palestinian question. And the Biden administration stuck with and added its own layers of nonsense to this approach, and they believed their own lies, and they lost eye contact with what was really going on. The other thing is that as America wanted to draw down in the Middle East, and I think that they did intend to do that, they wanted to draw down while still maintaining this notion that you can't deal in a comprehensive fashion in an architecture that would include Iran. So you kind of had a move towards that under Obama with the JCPOA. Trump pulls out of that. And if there was a chance for the Biden administration to get back in, they decide that it is perhaps too politically costly, politically difficult, and they didn't go for it. And so what you have is a US that has not tried to achieve a comprehensive de-escalation. And you actually have regional actors increasingly moving down that path. But Israel's not been part of it because the Israel-Iran equation has been deemed impossible to improve, with America encouraging it up that ladder. And the Israel-Palestine equation is that Israel doesn't want to deal with the Palestinians. Israel wants to continue to occupy, make it worse. And Israel has impunity, thanks to America, to do what it wants. And so you've had Saudi and Iran, with Chinese mediation, improve their relations, but you still have a US that is trying to drive the path of escalation. And I mention these things because if we look at where can we go from here, we have to correct, I think, the three crucial failures of the past. Number one is that Israel should be indulged and encouraged down a path of denying Palestinians their rights, of violating international law, rather than down a path of resolving the dispossession of Palestinians by according them their rights. And I think that's done a huge disservice to Israel. Secondly, we have to address the fact that Palestinian politics has gone down this path where the party that committed to Oslo has been totally discredited, some by its own mistakes. The Palestinian polity has been divided. We could have brought Hamas in. America took a pass on Palestinian elections. I don't know if we can do that now, but you have to address the fact that the recognized Palestinian address does not have legitimacy with its people because it has been co-opted into the American-Israeli occupation superstructure. And we have to address the third shortcoming, which is you need a region-wide approach which actually tries to get all the relevant parties to the table. You know, the French president has hosted meetings about Iraq that involve the Iranians, the Gulfies, all of Iraq's immediate neighbors. China has hosted these talks, as I've said. America must not be warmongering, and its policy de facto lead in that direction and undermine the prospects of a broader regional peace.
What do you think the chances are of slipping into a World War III?
I think we see a real chance that the worse things get on the Palestinian front, the closer we get to a conflagration. And the other question to ask, and I'm not saying this is the case, but I think it should be in the mix, is whether the Israeli side look at this and say, is this the opportunity to actually try and address not just Hamas, but Hezbollah and other things? Because there's no framework to try and achieve long-term understandings with these actors. There's just the standard. There's no framework. America is here. We've got our people largely unified behind us. The West is backing us. America has positioned military assets directly in relation to this escalation. They will have to be dragged in because the narratives and the American politics is playing out in that way. Other Europeans might get dragged in. So Israel may be tempted to go for that moral hazard, although many in the military will say, for heaven's sake, we've got quite enough on our hands and we ain't been doing so well recently. But that temptation, I think, exists. And let's remember, Iran has other assets in the region, whether that's in Iraq, and we're seeing some action in that front, whether that's the Ansarallah Houthi movement in control of much of Yemen, whether that's in Syria, of course in Lebanon, and the region is boiling. So you are going to have public support for a broader conflagration. And rather than step back from that, and I think the American private messaging is to step back from that, but rather than acknowledge this link, that if you don't get the Palestinian front under control and Gaza under control and stop those horrific images, then you really risk this broader escalation. And I think the Biden visit, it did speak to performative American domestic politics, but I think it spoke to the concerns that they have. But I don't think he made any progress because, let's be blunt, Steve, the American president goes all the way to Israel and comes back, and the thing they can tout is 20 trucks of humanitarian aid, which, as of us speaking, still hasn't been allowed in. And the UN Secretary General and the UN humanitarian office are saying you need 450 trucks a day. Now, 20 trucks, Steve, 20 lorries of humanitarian aid, that should be what a junior desk officer is sent to the region to get. Maybe a deputy assistant secretary of state on a bad day. The president of the United States, and I think the world looks at this and says, wow, these guys can't control their allies. The power of these guys is palpably wilting in front of our very eyes.
In the past, we saw that there was enormous Jewish American support for what Israel did. It was very hard to touch that. But really, I've seen more divides in Israel and among the Jewish American community since early January, since the debates inside Israel about its Supreme Court, about the solvency of its own democracy. You've seen more divides, at least I've seen that, inside the American debate about Israel and its future and what democracy means and should look like and include. Now you look at this horrible attack and the response to Hamas, and we see a kind of eruption on college campuses in America. We also see 300 Jewish Americans arrested on the steps of the U.S. Capitol, basically saying our blood is the same, and they don't support the actions Israel is taking inside Gaza. So it has drawn things up. I'm interested in your perspective on that and whether something has changed in the terrain and the topography of classic support. And I should note that if you look at American support, and you poll American support today, overwhelming public support of Israel. 65% of Americans support Israel absolutely. 8% say you should publicly criticize what Israel is doing. 23% say do nothing. So in that mixture, I just want to be clear that Americans are very much supportive of the steps that Israel is taking now. But there are these pockets that surprise me of people looking a little bit differently at the terrain.
Well, I think there's a few things to be said here, Steve. And I think it would be staggering if that polling did not show what you shared with us, because of the relentless media narrative and the way that this is being described as they're worse than the Nazis, this is a second Holocaust, they're worse than Daesh, this is our 9/11, this is their 9/11. Now, I actually think that's a weird way to describe it, because Israel is there, a military regional superpower. To describe this as the Holocaust, I think borders on Holocaust revisionism, actually. But that's how it's playing out in that media landscape. And therefore, public opinion is where it is. Now, if you remember, there was massive support for the war in Afghanistan, for the war in Iraq, and that eroded, and people saw where that was leading the United States. Now, also, had you have been polling a few weeks ago in a different reality and in a different media landscape, actually what you saw was the American public shifting very perceptibly in a different direction, to questioning America's role in this, to questioning Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. And that was especially true of Democrat voters, and that was also true of the American Jewish community. Now, the American Jewish community is hurting. I mean, this is hard. It's hurting in several levels. Just what happened is horrendous. Just the demographic as who were the victims in the 1,400 Israeli casualties and in those being taken prisoner. You know, this is, I mean, it doesn't matter who they are, but this just happens to be a lot. Folks from kibbutzim, folks who go out to a rave on a Sabbath. So it's not the religious crew. So it's those who, the more reformed, secular, kind of liberal America, would in their inner or outer circles know people who've been impacted. This is a community hurting. You have a Palestinian, Arab American, Muslim American community who is seeing the indifference to Palestinian life, seeing what is happening in Gaza. Doesn't justify what went on October 7th. I think the president managed to talk in very warm human terms about Arab and Palestinian Americans. He still failed to talk in warm human terms about the Palestinians on the ground who are dying every day. So that's the landscape in America. But as you say, it comes against a backdrop of, for months, American Jews, the vast majority, looking at Israel, looking at a government with overt racists, people who are right now handing out weapons to Israeli civilians to go and do their worst, who were carrying out, and this was the language being used in Israel, in the West, pogroms against Palestinians, and they were. And senior ministers who have plans for the mass expulsion of Palestinians. This is now part of the Israeli narrative, that there needs to be a second mass ethnic cleansing, a second Nakba. And they were saying, wow, what's going on? What's gone wrong? Now, I understand that there's an immediate recoil after October 7th. But I think a lot of American Jews look at the deep malaise, look at the divisive figure that Benjamin Netanyahu is, really dislike Netanyahu. And they wonder what becomes of Israel. And the other piece of this is Israel's image as a strong country has taken a tremendous hit. And I don't think you can reestablish that just by seeing more Palestinian blood. I actually think what you have to demonstrate today is that Israel can be a smart, strategically thoughtful, understanding of the environment it's in. Because if we really look at Israel in that region and say, these guys are never going to accept us, we can never live here, then is this good for collective Jewish security now and in the future? And I think what it would be great to have is a responsible adult who's Israel's closest ally, who can speak, at least in privately, and get just far enough publicly to that conversation. And they have conspicuously failed to do so, because if these are the new Nazis and the worse than ISIS, then you're on an exterminationist path, and then you're on the road to hell.
Let me ask you finally, Daniel, and very quickly, is Bibi Netanyahu strengthened or weakened by this moment? And when you look over time, you know, who's got time on their side in this conflict?
Look, I think Netanyahu will have to, at some moment, face the music on how this happened. And I think that happens the morning after the dust settles. And I don't think he wants to get to that day, which I think makes him a very, very dangerous leader. And he is not, I don't think he can be such a unifying character after everything that's happened. So I don't think time is on his side. Wartime might be on his side, scarily enough. I worry that for the Palestinians, there could be an effort here at a mass displacement. And so I worry how much time is on their side, even though I think that there is a tendency in certain quarters to think very long term. I also worry whether time is on America's side. And let me close with that thought, because I think the look, America and the president has wrapped himself in the indispensable nation, the world needs us. And, I've got news for you. The rest of the world doesn't see it that way. And I think America has done tremendous damage to its reputation, because people were looking at the Ukraine crisis and saying, we've got you clocked. You apply these things selectively. And now America has gone out and proven that when Israel violates international law, it's okay, which they were doing on October 6th before that happens, and now they're doing in Gaza. And when America vetoes a resolution, which is quite a mild resolution of the Security Council, negotiated also with the Americans, put forward by Brazil, the rest of the world, other than Russia and Britain, which abstained, is backing it. America looks like an outlier, not like a model to be emulated, but like a country that is fundamentally getting its priorities wrong and doesn't care when there is a boomerang effect across much of the rest of the world. And we are seeing an America that looks like a warmongering nation. And I worry for that. I worry for that reputation.
Well, with that, we will end this very somber discussion here. Daniel Levy, president of the U.S. Middle East Project and former advisor to the Israeli government, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Steve.
So what's the bottom line? Israelis were hit in such a way that they thought impossible, and this fuels their outrage. Whether they're progressive, conservative, far-right zealots, wherever they are, they say they want the perpetrators wiped out. But it's not going to be an easy or neat process, and innocent Palestinians are going to die by the hundreds every day. This could escalate, and I mean dramatically escalate. And in the West, it's hard to imagine that cooler heads are going to prevail. My guest today, Daniel Levy, has always told me that the Palestine-Israel divide is never going to simmer down and just go away on its own. It will always come back, screaming back, unless it's resolved. The events of this month really prove his point. The conflict stayed dormant and low level for years and years, but now it's back big time. With or without the Hamas attacks of October 7th, it's hard to be optimistic that it's going to be resolved anytime soon. And that, sadly, is the bottom line.